Hello, and welcome to Module 4 on evidence-based interventions. I'm Dr. Sarah Fox, a Senior Fellow with the Global Brain Health Institute and Project Manager with Dementia United. Today in this recording, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about brain health and how we can reduce our risk of developing dementia. So, before we start to talk about brain health specifically, I'd like to take us a few steps back and to think about the underlying causes of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So we largely know that in the brains of people living with dementia, different types of dementia and Alzheimer's, there's something biologically going on there. What this tends to equate to is proteins within the brain which have been processed and have folded themselves incorrectly. These tend to be cellular components or parts of nerve cells which would otherwise, in healthy brains, they'd have a normal function and they'd help the brain function normally. But something happens to these proteins, causing them to be processed incorrectly and to fold in a different way. What then tends to happen is not only are they not carrying out their specific function, but they can collect together and they can become kind of sticky, we call it, but I mean, much more technical terms for that, but we'll call it sticky. And they coalesce and join together. And when enough of them join, it can cause the death of the cells around them. And this is really what's going on in the brain of people living with dementia or Alzheimer's. So different types of dementia will have different types of misfolded proteins. So in Alzheimer's disease, you'd be looking at a protein called amyloid beta. Again, a protein that has a set function in the normal brain, in the healthy brain. But when people are developing this Alzheimer's disease, this protein will be misfolded and it'll be processed in a different way. It's slightly shorter than the regular protein and misfolded. It's the same with Lewy body dementia, just again, a different type of protein becomes misfolded. This one's alpha-synuclein. So why is this interesting? So something I found out relatively recently in my studies is that these misfolded proteins can start building up relatively early in life. So you can see this decades before individuals are experiencing any kind of external cognitive changes. So externally and cognitively, they'll be standard, they'll be normal, but in their brains, you'll be able to see the beginnings of the buildup of this protein. So this gives the idea that perhaps as this protein builds up, there's maybe a critical level, there's a point where there's enough of it, and not only is it coalescing and sitting there in cells, but it's causing cell death and it's causing other things to happen. So perhaps there's kind of a critical level. But what's even more interesting is you can actually see individuals with the same amount of misfolded protein, so they'll both have similar amounts and a similar distribution of this within their brain. But if you look at their the scores on cognitive tests, one of them might be living with dementia, they might be diagnosable, whereas the other one will be cognitively normal. Now, the same thing is within both of these brains, yet the external symptoms are quite different. So this is suggesting that yes, we're quite sure that these misfolded proteins and plaques, they're necessary. They are part of the disease, and that's why you'll probably see that a lot of the treatments that are being developed around Alzheimer's specifically are looking at interrupting the pathway that that causes these proteins to develop. But maybe they're not sufficient. Maybe there's something else going on in the brain that means that some people, even though there's quite a few of these proteins sitting there, they're not quite yet expressing that same cognitive deficit as other people. So there's something else going on here, but what could that be? So what might be happening, which means that two individuals with a similar distribution and amount of pathology within their brains might be experiencing quite different cognitive symptoms. One explanation is something we refer to as cognitive reserve. So, although the gross structure of our brains, where the lobes are and where the bits are generally, is maintained, so my brain will look very similar to your brain, when we come down to the kind of fine level, what's happening with those cells specifically, the synapses and all the little tendrils that come out from them, our brains are very different, and they're shaped by our lives. They're shaped by our education, our lifestyle, and what things we do in our day-to-day experiences. A really interesting study, actually, which can show this, is of London taxi drivers. So there's an area of the brain called the hippocampus. You may have heard of this before because it's heavily linked with memory and is impacted in Alzheimer's disease. Now, a certain region of the hippocampus seems much larger in London taxi drivers than it does in other individuals. Now, this part of the brain is also linked with navigation and finding your way around an environment. Some really interesting studies around this, which I can provide some links to as extra material. But what you can see is that the experience of these taxi drivers has actually led to a change in this structure of their brains. So yeah, it's interesting that our brains can change their structure based on our experience. So one suggestion is, for some people, the experiences that have shaped their brains have meant that their capacity or the way their brain works is better at compensating and still being able to function despite the existence of this pathology within their brains. So this is called cognitive reserve. We've got a lovely definition here. And so cognitive reserve is classed as the brain's ability to optimize and maximize its performance through differential recruitments of different brain networks and the use of different coping strategies to kind of work around and to cope with brain dysfunctions, so such as amyloid pathology. So we think that maybe individuals with a high cognitive reserve may have a higher threshold for a dementia diagnosis. Thinking about our analogy that there's almost a critical level of pathology within the brain, that once you go beyond that, you're diagnosable with dementia. We could say we maybe have a jug, and this line here on the jug, when we fill it with liquid, once it crosses this line, you might be diagnosable. People with a higher cognitive reserve, the line might be in the same place, but the jug is wider. So it takes longer to get there. They probably will still develop dementia, but these coping strategies they've built throughout life and the kind of change and difference in their brain structure means that it'll take longer and more pathology for them to reach that kind of critical mass and to be diagnosable with dementia. An interesting real world example of this might be the case of Robin Williams, one of my favorite actors, a wonderfully intelligent and funny, funny man. I loved his movies. So lots of people probably won't be aware that Robin actually died with a form of dementia called Lewy body dementia. But this wasn't diagnosed while he was alive. This was actually diagnosed after autopsy. I was lucky enough, as part of my work with Global Brain Institute, to work with the doctor who assessed this pathology in Robin's brain. And what he was very, very surprised by is on autopsy, when looking at the brain tissue, what he found was a significant amount of the Lewy body pathology within this brain, to the extent that you would have imagined this would have been something that was heavily impacting on him and something that would have been diagnosed while he was alive. But actually, he was filming right up until not long before his death. And although obviously there were changes, and there's a really interesting documentary called Robin's Wish, which if you're able to watch it, I really think is worth watching. So he was experiencing cognitive difficulties, but definitely not to the extent that you would have imagined, considering how much pathology was present within his brain. So Dr. Miller suggested that perhaps people who have great brains, who are incredibly brilliant, have this ability to tolerate the degenerative disease better than others. So a question is, how can we use this information? If it's suggested that people with healthier, more flexible, more active brains are better able to withstand the damage caused by dementia, what can we all be doing to make sure that this is us, to make sure that our brains are as dementia resistant as possible? So this now links in with some really interesting work that has been coming out relatively recently, looking at long-term lifestyle risk factors which could impact people's propensity to develop dementia as they get older. So research suggests that there are 12 risk factors which build up across the life course, some starting very early on. So we're thinking things like early years education, but others that come in later in life. So perhaps physical exercise, smoking, hearing loss, very interestingly. So I was lucky enough to go to a presentation by Jill Livingston, who is one of the lead researchers in this area. And she actually said that hearing loss is one of the biggest risk factors for dementia. And that was quite surprising to her, especially since hearing loss is something that we think we can probably tackle later in life. And studies suggest that people with hearing aids do have a reduced risk. So they do make a difference. So from this starting point, I'd quite like to do a little bit of a deep dive into a few of the things that we think are important for keeping our brains healthy throughout life, increasing our cognitive reserve, and increasing our resistance to dementia pathology as we grow older. One of the first areas I'm going to look into, and something that I think is quite accessible to many people, is the contribution of our gut health to the health of our brains. This might seem a bit of an unusual connection, but actually our brains and our guts are in constant communication on something we call the gut-brain axis. And in fact, our digestive system is sometimes referred to as the enteric nervous system and the second nervous system of our body, because it contains almost as many or just as many neurons as you would find in the brain. So what's happening in our guts is really important. And a lot that occurs here is related to the microbes, the little microbes that live in our guts, and all over our body. Where shocking and disturbing fact is that we are 50% microbes, so we are not entirely human. We are definitely a collection of a fair number of different cells. And if our gut bacteria were to be compressed into an organ on its own, it would weigh about 1.5 kilograms. So that's the same as 3 basketballs. So there's a lot of little creatures doing things in there, and what they're doing can impact what's happening in our brain. So it's important to make sure that the diversity of this bacteria in our gut is the type of bacteria that can lead to positive brain health and a positive gut-brain axis. So we suggest that we increase the good bacteria. How do we do that? Again, a few simple steps. So probiotics. So these are things like fermented fruit, fermented dairy, so the yogurts you can buy. This can possibly increase the number of good bacteria in our gut. We also have something called prebiotics. So these are kind of the building blocks for good bacteria. And if we have enough of these in our diet, it might increase the number. So these are things like banana, ginger, dark chocolate, broccoli. So there are certain things we can be doing with our diet that can improve the number of good bacteria in our gut, and also may in turn have an impact on our brain health. I'm not going to go into a whole load of detail, but I can probably provide some interesting papers and supplementary reading around this, because it is quite interesting how the bacteria in our gut process certain chemicals which can cause changes in neurotransmitter levels and just the way our brains function. So very interesting. Again, I'm not saying that eating fermented fruit or dairy is going to stop you from developing dementia. This is very much many small changes could lead to a reduced risk later in life on a population level, but it's something that could lead to reduced risk. So put all of this together and hopefully we'll increase our brain health together. We've spoken a little bit about gut health and the bacteria that live in our guts, but also nutrition in general is really important to our brain. We are what we eat, and what we put in our body impacts all of our different organs. So the brain is a very energy hungry organ. It takes about 20% of our body's energy. So eating the correct foods to keep it fueled is really important. And there are certain foods that do really useful things for the brain, such as improve blood flow or reduce inflammation. And again, can probably provide some extra links, but we probably know the problems that can be linked to poor blood flow in the brain. And when we think of things like vascular dementia, but even Alzheimer's and other types of dementia, evidence is arising that these might be linked to very small changes in blood flow as well. So anything that's increasing and improving our blood flow, brilliant. And inflammation as well. There's a lot of really interesting research on how inflammation impacts on Alzheimer's and dementia pathology and how those two interact. So what kind of foods are we looking at? You're often seeing in Daily Mail, newspapers, certain foods hailed as being a wonder food, and they're probably, obviously there's evidence behind this, and that's great, but it's never going to be one single food that is going to stop you developing dementia. That's, kind of things that sell newspapers, but isn't necessarily the full story. So what we're looking at really is that there's certain types of diet which are healthier for the brain rather than others. And these would be things like the Mediterranean diet. There's also something called the Mind and Dash diet, very closely linked to Mediterranean. So these are high in things like healthy fats. So fatty acids, they're essential components of the neurons in our brains. And this can also help, omega-3 fatty acids can help reduce inflammation. Certain vitamins that you find in whole grains, leafy vegetables, eggs, and some types of meat can be great. And also for people who enjoy red wine and dark chocolates, like me, polyphenols can help boost the blood flow to the brain. But again, when it comes to wine, we go moderation, and the same with chocolate. And we're looking at dark chocolate really rather than chocolate. So also, of course, what's good for the heart is good for the head. And this is where these Mediterranean Dash and Mind diets are coming in. So broad recommendations are fruit, veg, oily fish, whole grains. And we're looking to cut back a little bit on the red meat, the white rice and bread, sugars, and whole fat dairy as well. Interestingly, I'll provide a link to this. So through my work with Dementia United, we've recently worked with a local chef in Greater Manchester who's helped us develop a number of recipes based on the Mind diet. I've tried a couple of these, and I'm a terrible cook, and I still managed to do it. So they're really good. They taste brilliant, even though they don't have all those lovely fats and sugars in them. So definitely recommend giving those a look. Exercise. So you might be able to tell that I'm standing whilst I'm doing this. I set that up deliberately so I could make a point. It's important to include movement in your daily life. So moving a little is good, moving more is wonderful. I personally am a big fan of walking. When I used to work at the University of Manchester, I studied the area of the brain called the hippocampus, which I think I mentioned earlier. And not everyone knows, but this area of the brain is stimulated into action by walking and by movement. So I know I definitely used to find, this is anecdotal, so excuse the anecdotes, but when I was younger, if I was trying to remember something, I would always walk around our living room. And I wonder if that's linked to the fact that the memory centers are activated as you walk. It's very interesting. So physical activity is really beneficial, and it's never too early or too late to be doing this. Evidence does suggest that in people living with a mild cognitive impairment, increase in their activity levels can improve cognition and might slow decline in some people. Many things that you can do. I think one problem is a lot of people will hear the term exercise and think, oh, this means going down the gym, weightlifting, jogging. of course, all that stuff is brilliant if you're able to do it, but it can be as little as standing a little bit more whilst you're trying to work rather than sitting down, or dancing to your favorite song in the kitchen, maybe taking a walk at midday. So there's a lot that you can be doing. And again, I'll provide a few extra links in the supplementary material for this. So sleep. Sleep is also particularly important to our brain health, and interestingly isn't one of the 12 risk factors noted on one of the earlier slides, but many academics will say that sleep is very important and definitely should be somewhere on this list. I'm sure many of us have experienced what it's like when you've had a number of sleepless nights and maybe your brain's quite foggy, you're not able to focus or communicate properly. And again, you just need a good night's sleep. Brain fog is a problem. So brain activity while you sleep can be important to consolidate memories. So those dreams you're having at night are a way for the brain to take what you've learned during the day, process it, formulate it, and store it into long-term memories. So periods of sleep are really important for that. Studies have also found that toxins within the brain and possibly some of these misfolded beta amyloid proteins might be cleared during sleep activity as well. So again, many reasons to try and get a good night's sleep. How can we do this? I think routine is probably key. Good sleep hygiene, so getting as much sunlight as you can during the day, possibly difficult depending if, well, what city in the UK you're living in Greater Manchester, that can be hard. Getting exercise during the day, so a good way to make sure your biological clock is set in the right way is to wake up and start your day with a little bit of gentle exercise. Avoiding caffeine after lunch if you can also can be quite a difficult one. But also, given all that, don't over worry about the occasional sleepless night. It happens, we all have them. So sometimes the more you're worrying, oh my goodness, I'm not sleeping, the less likely you are to sleep, and it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So try not to over worry. Another good one is just to make sure, again, hard to do, but to make sure you don't have screens in your bedroom. Bedroom is probably reserved for reading, maybe before you go to sleep, but no laptops or mobile phones in the bedroom. Hard to stick to, but if you're having trouble getting to sleep, this is something that could make a really big difference. An active mind. So keeping our brains active and engaged and learning new things as we grow older is really important. And I think this is something that's really interesting, especially for people living with a mild cognitive impairment. Because obviously experiencing a cognitive decline can mean you're losing confidence and maybe you're less willing to go out and to socialize and to continue doing the things that you would otherwise enjoy. Unfortunately, that drawing back and isolating and removing yourself from the things that you used to do could actually increase cognitive decline. We've probably seen some of this, or many, carers and people living with dementia have noticed that during the pandemic and during the lockdowns, their loved ones' cognition declined significantly when they weren't able to go out and participate in the activities they would otherwise be doing. So I think this one's really important, but the really positive message we have here is that I don't think it's prescriptive. Some people will see that notion of active mind and they'll instantly jump to thinking, oh, do we have to be doing Sudoku? Do we have to be doing crosswords, brain training? But I think it's a lot simpler than that, which is really good. It's this notion of just staying social and staying engaged in the activities that you've always enjoyed, and maybe adding a few extra to your repertoire if you're able to. So this could be as simple as going out to the theatre with friends or taking part in an arts class, maybe a choir. Interestingly, not only do these things keep our brains active through the socializing and just taking in new information, an arts class or maybe even a dance class will also contribute to keeping you physically fit and active as well. So I think this is a really important one, and it's something that I hope can help people living with an MCI, to kind of build some hope and to think, well, actually, what's most important for me is to continue doing those things that are important, and to try and keep interacting and doing the things that I have always enjoyed. So finally, is really keeping on top of your general health. We all know what's good for the heart is good for the head. So any issues around your, high blood pressure or, circulatory problems, make sure you're going to your doctor and make sure those are under control. It's the same with diabetes. Unchecked diabetes is a risk factor. So making sure that you're taking medication and you're managing that as best as possible. And I think I mentioned previously as well, hearing loss, one of the largest risk factors for dementia, and technically one of the most treatable as well. So very important to be keeping on top of your physical health too. I'll include several links to a lot of this information, so don't worry, this has been a little bit of a whistle stop, but there's a lot to take in around this, but a lot of really useful advice to give people with an MCI, and to give them that kind of autonomy to think, well, actually, there's lots of things that I can be doing, and it's possible that I can change my trajectory by really paying attention to all these factors that contribute to the overall health of my brain. And even if that still means later in life, this pathology is there, it's building, maybe this will slow the progression of the disease. And a lot of things will probably improve your well-being in the meantime as well. So I hope this has been useful. Thank you for listening.